When you look at the headlines screaming about betrayal and broken families and a daughter turning against a father, you might feel a sudden rush of emotion. You might feel sympathy for the collapse of a family bond, or you might feel a sense of vindication that justice is finally being served. It is easy to view this through the lens of a Shakespearean tragedy played out on 24-hour cable news where the characters are larger than life and the stakes are purely personal. But I want you to step back from the drama for a moment. I want you to resist the urge to see this merely as a soap opera about the Trump dynasty. If you strip away the sentiment and look at this situation through the cold, measured lens of economics and institutional power, you see something very different. You see a negotiation. You see a rational actor performing a cost-benefit analysis under extreme duress. You see exactly what happens when the sovereign power of the state is leveraged against the private accumulation of capital. We are going to look past the sensationalism today. We are going to examine the mechanics of immunity, the leverage of asset forfeiture, and the structural realities that force a business empire to cannibalize itself. This is not just about one famous family. It is a case study in the fragility of wealth when it comes into direct conflict with the law. You might think this has nothing to do with your life or your job or your savings. You go to work, you pay your taxes, and you try to build a future for your children. But the forces at play here and the way legal threats can force a rational actor to abandon their deepest loyalties tells us a great deal about the incentives that govern our entire economic system. Let us be clear about what is actually happening here according to the reports that have shaken the political world. We are told that Congress has utilized a very specific and devastating form of leverage. They did not just ask for testimony, they reportedly placed the personal wealth and future business viability of Ivanka Trump on the table. This is the critical variable that changes the entire equation. In the world of high finance and corporate governance, we know that individuals will often take a hit for the team if the penalty is manageable. A fine is often just a cost of doing business. A short sentence might be worn as a badge of honor or loyalty, but the total erasure of wealth, the seizing of personal assets, and the banning of future commercial activity is a different category of risk entirely. It is what we might call a ruinous outcome. When you are faced with a ruinous outcome, the calculus changes immediately. You stop thinking about the collective good of the firm or the family, and you start thinking about survival. This is the moment where the interests of the principal and the agent diverge. For years, we have viewed the Trump family business as a monolithic entity where the interests of the father and the children were perfectly aligned. They were all equity holders in the same brand, and they all benefited from the same flow of power. But the introduction of immunity for one at the expense of another breaks that alignment. It creates a classic prisoner's dilemma. If you stay silent, you lose everything, including your ability to operate in the market. If you speak, you keep your fortune, but you destroy the patriarch. The rational actor model predicts exactly what we are seeing now. The individual chooses to preserve their own capital stock rather than go down with the sinking ship. You need to understand the mechanics of this transaction because it affects how you view power in your own society. The state possesses the ultimate leverage because it has the power to define and revoke property rights. What we are seeing is the state exercising that sovereign power to extract information that it deems valuable. Information is a commodity. In this specific market, the price of that commodity was immunity. The regulators and the committee members made a calculation. They decided that the testimony, the secrets, the blueprints of the operation, as the reports call them, were worth more than punishing this specific individual. They effectively bought her cooperation, and the currency they used was her own freedom and her own money. This is a trade. It is a high-stakes exchange executed behind closed doors in a secure location. And just like any major market trade, it sends a signal. It signals that the dynasty is no longer a unified fortress. It is a collection of individuals with separate balance sheets and separate risk tolerances. Once you understand that, you understand why this flip happened. We also need to consider the concept of legacy versus liquidity. For the patriarch, the legacy is the primary asset. the brand, the name, the historical record. He is willing to spend down his actual capital to protect that intangible asset. But for the next generation, for someone like Ivanka, the calculation is fundamentally different. She has a longer time horizon. She has decades of potential earnings and social positioning ahead of her. To sacrifice her future liquidity and her standing for the sake of a legacy that is currently under siege is a bad trade. It is a negative return on investment. So when the pressure maxed out, when the threat became absolute, she liquidated her position in the family loyalty market and moved into the safety of immunity. Think about the term insiders used in the reports. We are told insiders confirmed this deal. In economic terms, an insider is someone who possesses asymmetric information. Information that the market, or in this case the public and the law, does not have. This information has value. Usually insiders hoard this information to maintain their advantage. But when the cost of holding that information becomes too high, they dump it. Ivanka is essentially dumping her stock of private knowledge into the congressional record in exchange for a bailout. That is what immunity is in this context. It is a bailout for a distressed asset holder. She was holding toxic assets, which were the secrets of the family business, and she swapped them for a clean slate. The devastation reported on the part of the president is not just emotional heartbreak, it is the realization that his information monopoly is gone. The barrier to entry for his prosecutors has been removed. The blueprint is out. This reveals a structural weakness in any organization that relies on personal loyalty over institutional checks and balances. Loyalty is an unwritten contract. It is not enforceable in court. And when an unwritten contract meets the hard-written statutes of federal law, the unwritten contract almost always fails. We are watching that failure happen in real time. It is a harsh reminder that in the face of systemic pressure, human relationships are often the first thing to be securitized and sold. As we dig deeper into this, we have to ask what this means for the stability of the entire structure she helped build. If the architect gives up the blueprints, the building cannot stand. When we speak of blueprints in this context, we are not merely talking about architectural drawings or construction plans for luxury hotels. We are talking about the architecture of value itself. We are talking about the internal logic of an empire built on debt valuation and the subjective pricing of assets. You have to understand that in the upper echelons of real estate and brand licensing, wealth is often less about cash in the bank and more about the perception of solvency. It is a confidence game in the strictest economic sense of the term. The reports indicate that Ivanka was the one who knew the true spread between the public claims and the private reality. This is where the story shifts from a political drama to a lesson in forensic accounting and systemic risk. For years, the business operated on a principle that many of you might recognize from your own struggles with credit scores and loan applications, but on a scale that renders the comparison almost absurd. The principle is that if you owe the bank a little money, it is your problem, but if you owe the bank $1 billion, it is their problem. That dynamic creates a shield. It creates a form of immunity born of leverage. But Congress found a way to bypass the banks and go straight to the asset holders. By threatening the personal wealth of the key lieutenant, they effectively pierce the corporate veil. This is a legal concept that is crucial for you to understand. Usually a corporation protects the individual owners from liability. The business can go bankrupt, but the owner keeps their house. In this case, the investigators made it clear that the veil would not hold. They made it clear that the daughter's assets were not distinct from the father's liabilities. This brings us to the specific mechanics of the deal that was struck. Immunity is a powerful tool, but it is rarely granted without a specific verified asset in return. The state does not give away a get-out-of-jail-free card for vague generalities. They trade it for actionable data. What Congress likely demanded and what sources suggest was delivered is the audit trail. You need to think about what this means for the concept of loyalty in a capitalist structure. We are often sold this myth of the family business as a sacred bond that transcends market forces. We see it in television shows, and we see it in the branding of dynasties. But at its core, a family business is still a business. It is still a collection of contracts and incentives. When the incentive structure is inverted, the behavior changes. Ivanka was not just a daughter in this equation, she was a senior executive. She was a rational economic agent facing a solvency crisis. The immunity deal was effectively a restructuring of her personal liabilities. She divested herself of the toxic asset, which was her father's legal exposure, and she retained her core capital, which was her freedom and her remaining financial standing. It is a brutal calculation, but it is the same calculation that private equity firms make every day when they strip assets from a failing company and leave the workers with nothing. The only difference here is that the asset being stripped is a former president, and the firm doing the stripping is his own flesh and blood. I want you to pause and think about how this applies to your own life and your own understanding of the economy. You might be sitting there thinking that you would never turn on your family for money. You might value loyalty above all else, and that is a noble sentiment. But you likely do not operate in a world where your relationships are securitized. You do not operate in a world where your dinner conversations are potential evidence in a federal investigation. This situation reveals the corrosive nature of mixing ultimate political power with a private profit-seeking enterprise. When you turn the government into a family business and the family business into a government operation, you erase the boundaries that make normal human ethics possible. Everything becomes a transaction. Every relationship becomes a line item on a balance sheet. And when the auditors come knocking, as they inevitably do, every line item is up for review. The tragedy here is not just the betrayal of a father by a daughter. The tragedy is that we have built a political and economic system that rewards this kind of maneuvering. We have built a system where power is so concentrated and the stakes are so high that basic human decency is priced out of the market. The daughter did what the system trained her to do. She protected her equity. Let us look at the role of the state institutions in this specific pressure campaign. It is important to acknowledge that the power to seize assets and ban businesses is a terrifying power. We often cheer when it is used against people we dislike or people we believe are corrupt. But as an economist looking at institutional stability, I have to point out that this is a weapon that can be pointed in any direction. The state used the threat of economic annihilation to force a witness to flip. In legal terms, this is standard procedure. In economic terms, it is a coercive monopoly. The state holds the monopoly on force, and it used that monopoly to extract a price. The price was the truth, or at least the version of the truth, that the daughter provided. We have to ask ourselves what kind of precedent this sets. If the government can threaten the children of political figures with financial ruin to get to the parents, are we comfortable with that mechanism? Or do we accept it because in this specific case, the accumulation of wealth was so opaque and potentially fraudulent that there was no other way to penetrate the fortress? These are the hard questions that go beyond the headlines. It forces us to look at the relationship between justice and power. Is justice simply the will of the state exercised through superior leverage? In this case, it appears so. The result may be desirable for those who want accountability, but the method is one of raw force. Now, we must consider the content of the testimony itself. What makes it so valuable that it was worth full immunity? The reports mention secrets and deals. In the world of high-end real estate and global licensing deals are rarely straightforward. They involve layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and tax strategies that push the boundaries of the law. If Ivanka was the one managing these details, as she often was, then she holds the keys to the map. She knows where the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. But more importantly, she knows the intent. In white-collar, crime-proving intent is the hardest part. You can prove that money was lost or that forms were filled out incorrectly. But proving that it was done on purpose to defraud the government or investors requires a witness who was in the room. It requires someone who heard the instructions given. That is the premium value of her testimony. She is not just a witness to the crime, she is a witness to the state of mind. And that is why the immunity was granted. She provided the missing link that turns a civil dispute into a criminal conviction. This is the commodity she sold, and the market cleared the transaction instantly. The silence from the top is perhaps the most telling economic indicator of all. We are used to a constant stream of noise, a relentless barrage of defense and counterattack that serves as a distraction strategy. But the reports say the former president has not spoken a word since this news broke. In the study of power dynamics, silence usually indicates a loss of agency. When you control the narrative, you speak. When the narrative controls you, you go quiet. The betrayal described in these reports is absolute, not because it is a daughter turning on a father, but because it represents the total collapse of the internal control mechanism. For decades, the organization relied on a very specific management style where loyalty was the primary currency and competence was secondary. This is a feudal structure operating within a capitalist democracy. In a feudal system, the lord provides protection and the vassals provide service. But the moment the lord can no longer provide protection, in this case legal protection from the state, the vassals are free to seek a new arrangement. Ivanka seeking immunity is simply a vassal realizing that the castle walls have been breached and negotiating terms with the besieging army. It is the end of the feudal contract. You need to understand what unlocking the vault actually means in a forensic sense. We are not talking about a physical safe filled with gold bars. We are talking about the reconciliation of two different sets of books. In many organizations that operate on the edge of regulation, there is often a gap between what is told to the tax authority and what is told to the lender. One set of numbers minimizes value to reduce tax liability, and the other maximizes value to secure loans. This arbitrage of valuation is where the real danger lies. If Ivanka has handed over the keys to this reconciliation, she has effectively provided the roadmap for a systemic dismantling of the entire asset base. This is why the dynasty is in jeopardy. A dynasty, in the modern economic sense, is not just a bloodline, it is a brand that commands a premium in the marketplace. It allows you to charge more for a hotel room or a tie or a condominium simply because the name is on the door. But that brand equity is fragile. It relies on the projection of success and invulnerability. If the testimony reveals that the success was manufactured or that the solvency was an illusion, the brand premium evaporates. We are looking at a potential market correction of the Trump brand that could value it at zero. Think about how this applies to the institutions you interact with every day. You trust your bank to hold your money. You trust your insurance company to pay your claim. You trust your employer to make payroll. This trust is based on the assumption that these institutions are following the rules and that their stated value is real. When that trust is broken, when you realize that the figures were manipulated or the safety was an illusion, the panic sets in. We are witnessing a localized bank run on the credibility of the Trump organization. The creditors, the partners, and the political allies are all looking at this testimony and wondering if they need to pull their capital out before the crash. Ivanka was the first to pull her capital out. She withdrew her reputational capital and her legal standing from the family bank before it collapsed. It is a signal to everyone else in the orbit that the institution is insolvent. This is how empires fall. Not usually with a bang, but with a sudden frantic rush for the exits by the people who know the math best. We also have to talk about the concept of the secure location. The testimony is happening behind closed doors. This secrecy is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it protects the witness and the integrity of the investigation. On the other hand, it creates an information vacuum that will be filled with speculation. In financial markets, uncertainty is the enemy. When investors do not know the truth, they assume the worst. The political market works the same way. By taking this testimony, private Congress has effectively suspended trading on the Trump political stock. No one knows the true value of his political future because no one knows exactly what damaging information has been entered into the record. All we know is that the price of that information was total immunity. That suggests the liability is catastrophic. If the information was minor, a plea deal for a reduced sentence would have been the standard exchange. Immunity is the nuclear option. It implies that the witness provided evidence of a central role in a major systemic failure. This brings us back to the question of who gains and who loses. The immediate loser is obvious. The patriarch loses his shield and his confidant, but who gains? In the short term, the state gains a victory in its enforcement of the law, but in the long term, we have to ask if this strengthens our democratic institutions or if it merely deepens the cynicism that many of you feel. If the only way to hold the powerful accountable is to cut deals with other powerful people to let some walk free so others can be punished, does that feel like justice to you? Or does it feel like another game where the elites trade chips while the average person would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law for a fraction of the offense? It is important to look at this not just as a victory for the prosecution, but as a revelation of how the game is played. The daughter gets to keep her assets. She gets to keep her freedom. She gets to walk away from the wreckage she helped create because she had something to sell. Most people who find themselves in legal trouble have nothing to sell. They have no leverage. They just face the consequences. This stark contrast in outcomes based on what you have to trade is a defining feature of our justice system and our economic system. It is a feature we need to be honest about as we watch this drama unfold. The system works for those who can afford to negotiate with it. For everyone else, it just works on them. It works